Welcome. On this Tuesday, December the 12th, is, by the way, the 108th anniversary of Yuan Shikai's announcement of the great legendary Empire of China. Yeah, let's see each other in a few months to see how that Empire of China went. Now, about today, we have our weekly update on the state of the meta and how things are going in Mythic Plus at the end of this fourth reset of Season 3. Now, before going into the specs, into the meta, into the flavor of the month, etc., let's go about the season. Let's talk about how we stopped each other looking at last week, the fortified week, and we mentioned and lamented how much more difficult Murazon's Rise was compared to the other dungeons. They were rather okay in terms of difficulty and even amongst themselves, and then you had the clear drop with Murazon's Rise. Now, at the end of this week, Murazon's Rise technically is still the hardest by quite a good margin compared to the rest, but now at the very least the difficulty level starts to be somewhat more in line with the rest. The biggest difficulty at the moment of this dungeon seems to be the timer being much tighter than its brother dungeon, for example, Galakrond's Fall. One of the more sensible changes could be for Murazon's Rise to steal 3 minutes of the timer of Galakrond's Fall for itself. That would make it a much more manageable dungeon. Besides the current difficulty of the dungeons, we haven't really had, much like we talked about yesterday, we are not getting any balance tuning for the specs in this reset, and we at the moment are also not getting any changes to the dungeons for this incoming reset. So as we go and look at the current situation of the specs in Mythic Plus, we can also expect this not to change greatly as we get into this new reset. Starting with the tanks and the healers, we can see the quite clear situation that we have seen recently, where Vengeance is quite clearly the overall better tank in general, in terms of both the popularity of the keys as well as the level of the keys being completed, with something similar happening to healers, where Discipline is the clear one, and then Mystery Monk is the one following right after. Talking about the damage of the DPS specs in the keys, we continue to have a handful of outliers, because if you look at the top damage done by the DPS in the top level keys in Mythic Plus, you will find the outlier of the first 4, and then a significant, almost over 20% less damage drop, starting from Red Paladin. It's a bit smaller for Enhancement Shaman and a few others like Balance Druid and Hunter, for example, but the drop is significant going downwards. There seems to be a quite clear set of 4 outlying specs in terms of overall damage. And then, of course, the deeper you go down, the more depressing it all becomes, because you have, Affliction struggling to even get actually past 200,000. Same goes for a few other specs like Arms Warrior, even some specs like Feral, like Devastation Evoker. It's not too good for these specs in terms of overall damage in Mythic Plus. You can also check, to be fair, the tanks and the healers too, because we can see Vengeance now topping the damage meters as well. For a long time this expansion, we mentioned that no matter the meta, no matter the tier level of Brewmaster, they were going to be the one with the most damage. Now, not only was Vengeance already better than Brewmaster in basically any other thing, now they also beat them. In damage. When it comes to healers, Discipline and Mistweaver continue to have the highest damage out of any other spec, which is not too surprising, also considering they do damage to heal in their rotation. Looking at something a bit more in-depth though than just the sheer amount of damage you do in a key, looking at, for example, the popularity, going into the high level of popularity of keys, you have, as usual, almost nearing 50% of popularity in the high level of keys. Same goes for the healers, which is always worth reminding for everyone, for both the tanks and the healers. When at 25 plus level, you see at least 1, 2, 3 tanks being playable. At 25 plus level, you see 1, 2, 3, 4 different healers being playable. It's a great set of diversity. It's a great set of options for you to play at the max level. It's very good. It's not nearly as good if you're a melee DPS, because it means 50% of all keys looking for a melee DPS will pick one Havoc Demon Hunter by default, and then if you're lucky, maybe a Rogue, or maybe a Red Paladin. So Melee is not getting this nearly as lucky this tier compared to the healers and the tanks when it comes to variety. Range DPS, meanwhile, is getting it better because, you know, truth be told, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the same class, and then 6 different possible ranged specs in terms of high pick rate in Mythic Plus. So it's a good situation, even looking at the high level of keys. Yes, there is a couple of recurring and returning colors, like for example Havoc Demon Hunter showing up way more than the rest, but even, for example, from a healer perspective, the colors start to be quite varied as you keep going down. You're still talking about very high keys, and there's a plenty of variety of choices. It's always worth reminding everyone that many of these picks varying is thanks to the necessity of the majority of the groups to have both Combat Res and Bloodlust in their group. And because you have plenty of choices, sometimes it makes it difficult to slot them together. For example, you could be taking a popular trio like a Vengeance Demon Hunter plus a Havoc Demon Hunter plus a Rogue, but then if you pick those three, you must pick a Bloodlust healer or Bloodlust DPS, and then you must pick a Combat Res healer or Combat Res DPS, which means the options start to become quite tight on who can you pick for last. So this is also being helped by having so many different available specs, because this is Bloodlust, this is Bloodlust, this is Combat Res, this is Combat Res, this is Bloodlust. Similarly, this is Combat Res, and this is Combat Res, and this is Bloodlust. So you do have to mix and match and sort of Tetris together these different buffs that you need for your comp. This is having a better impact in Mythic Plus's meta compared to last season's Exodia, unfortunately, thanks to the Guardian Druid having Combat Res, the Holy Paladin having Combat Res, the Fire Mage having Bloodlust, the Augmentation Evoker having Bloodlust. Really, they had no problems getting those tools for Mythic Plus. In terms of results, much like we mentioned yesterday for the raid, we are not getting balance tuning this reset, but we did get balance tuning last reset. We got nerfs, for example, to Havoc Demon Hunter's damage, we got nerfs to BM's damage, we got buffs to Unholy, buffs to Windwalker Monk, for example, when it comes to DPS specs. As was predictable, and as we just checked over here, it's not that nerfing Havoc Demon Hunter did anything for their damage. Even if we don't look at the top results and just look at the average, they are still significantly ahead. Even if we look at a different average, okay, it's not 227 with BM being at 204, it's instead 221 with BM being at 203. Does it change anything? No. Most of the other specs are still 10 to 20% behind in damage of Havoc, for example. So, as expected, nobody is shocked that the nerfs did not really change too much of the performance of Havoc or BM, for example, in terms of their meta power in Mythic Plus. Predictable tier lists as well, even going from u.gg to sub-creation, you have Havoc, Outlaw, Augmentation, Demo, and BM. Going back to here, you have Havoc, Outlaw, Augmentation, Demo, and BM being the best 5 performers. So this one seems, even though we just mentioned and praised the amount of variety and options you can have across your different keys, we do start to see some of the better performers being quite often the same 5. But, you know, the same 5 DPS is better than having the same 3 DPS performing the best, because at the very least with 5 you start having some more options. Especially as mentioned, when 2 out of these don't bring Bloodlust, 4 out of these don't bring Combat Res, means that if you try to start getting them, you may free up more room to other specs to bring, for example, something like a Combat Res. Like, for example, a Red Paladin, a Balanced Druid, maybe even an Unholy DK. So I think it's still good, even though the top 5 seems quite far ahead than the others. It's at the very least better than we had in Season 2. It could be better, of course, we could be getting an even better situation in terms of variety, but even now, I think with this level, what is only left to get is more nerfs to Havoc. After that, I think it's good in terms of nerfs. Then you can start thinking about the buffs. You can start thinking about specs like Elemental being buffed, you know, specs like the poor Shadow Priest being buffed. Although some might say after the season they had during their Exodia period, they kind of deserve to be here for a while, right? so maybe we can skip Shadow for this tier. But for the DPS, I think the situation is quite good. As long as you tone down enough, as long as you tone Havoc down enough to open up the possibilities even more, I think it's a good situation. Because remember, Havoc is not one of the mandatory specs in terms of Bloodlust and Combat Res. So freeing up a spot, or at the very least making it more even to other specs, is going to be even better for the choices you have in your group, based on how much you need a certain spec in your group. Talking about the situation as far as Dragonflight goes, this is how we are finding ourselves at the beginning of Season 3. We have gotten our whole run of Season 2. You can see the absolute despair of the red over here. This is the rating of variance, of variety, of picks, of specs being played in each of the 3 roles, and then the average. So this is the general set of variety. This is the DPS variety, tank variety, and heal variety. The smaller the number, the greener the number, the better for the players. You can see, of course, no surprise that the installation of the 10.1.5 Exodia suddenly turned into a massive red. Before that, it was very good. Dragonflight Season 1 was pretty good. The start of Season 2, before the reworks of Holy Paladin and the introduction of Augmentation Evoker, was also A-OK. And then we had the reign of terror of like 3+ months of those specs. The beginning of this season so far has been quite good. The balance is still nice. The heal especially is one of the more balanced of the expansion especially. You can just see it quite clearly over here, the amount of options of the specs compared to what we had right over here. Also for tanks, it's significantly better, obviously, compared to before. And even the DPS, not by a big amount, but you start seeing more choices, more options. Thankfully, augmentation was dominating before. Now it's being cut down by 40-ish% in terms of their presence in Mythic Plus, which is still decent. Some might say it's not enough. They might have wanted more. They might have wanted to see even fewer Augmentation Evokers after Season 2, but it's definitely still an improvement over Season 2, right? Technically, it's not that big of an improvement over Season 1. Season 1 DPS variety is still better. Same goes for the tank variety. The healer variety also was quite good in Season 1. So we will see as we progress throughout Season 3 if we will match this level of variety for Dragonflight, for the last season of Dragonflight. We can close the usual statistics with the general popular compositions to see any, starting to see any changes in the specs chosen for popularity. Not really. We do start to see a few, like 2 Prot Paladins starting to pop up over Vengeance Demon Hunters. We have 1 fewer Discipline Priest in the top 10 most popular comps in exchange for 1 Resto Druid, as well as fewer Rogues. That's the bigger change compared to the last couple of weeks. Now we have an almost full green wall of augmentation, an almost full, actually full but sort of skewed wall of Havoc, and then one for the third pick, the third DPS pick after those 2. That seems to be the general way to go for popular comps this reset, this Tyrannical Storming Raging reset of Mythic Plus. As mentioned, even throughout all of this, we are, at the end of this update, in a pretty good situation when it comes to Mythic Plus, in a pretty balanced, in a pretty even situation. For tanks, we have 3 of them being quite good, perhaps a slight nerf to Vengeance to bring them even closer to the other 2 options of popular tanks. Same goes for healers. Actually, they are already looking like they are doing quite evenly right now without any further changes needed. The only one that is a slight outlier is really just the top DPS, which are visibly these 4 DPS right here. If you were to fix these 4 by just a slight bit more, but in particular this DPS, the Havoc version of the DPS, I think it would be an even more balanced season, because even though these specs are ahead, they're not super far ahead. They are still at a reasonable level, a level where just a couple of nerfs, just a 5-ish% nerf could bring them even closer to the other specs, right? That I think is what is missing from this Mythic Plus season, which is a good season. It is definitely a better season than what we have gotten in the past few months at the end of Season 2, so it's still looking quite nice. Even the dungeons are not even that tragic to go through. yes, eventually in a few weeks, more and more players will start complaining because they will realize that some of these old dungeons contain one-shot mechanics that are not really fun to play around, from the racking pain of the last boss of Ataldazar, down to the Everbloom, basically the last 3 bosses mechanics, even down to the Dark Ticket mechanics, and not to mention the lovely From the Tides mechanic, from the first boss down to the Flame Shock Shaman boss. Eventually players will start noticing those being quite frustrating to play with, but besides those super high keys, the rest of the season when it comes to dungeon has been very good right now, compared especially to the last couple of seasons of Dragonflight. So in general, very good season, much better than what you've gotten in the past few months. Just tune a couple of these DPS a little bit more, and then we are set for a much smoother season. This is our weekly update as far as Mythic Plus is concerned on this Tuesday. We are thanking, as usual, for our goodbyes all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, also be given completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, enough with these lights, please. I think I need to tone them down a bit, either on the sides or the one in the middle. I don't need to be facing the sun when I'm talking to you guys.